Hi everyone, we're going to do a bit of a question and answer session today. I put up on social media and in my blog asking for questions, so I'm going to answer some of them. I actually got a lot more than I was expecting, so I may do more than one video, but let's get started. So I'm going to start. Donna from my blog asked me about brush care, which caused a little bit of hilarity because I'm not fantastic at taking care of my brushes, although I think I get a bit of a bad rap on that. And lately I have been trying to take better care of them. I was notorious, and I always have been, for not taking care of brushes, but I found some recently that I absolutely love, and they're from Rosemary & Co., which is a British company, and they're short-haired watercolour brushes. They came as part of a set, an Anna Mason set. I think she's a botanical artist, but I got them purely because they had the sizes I wanted, and it was cheaper to buy them as a set. And these are fantastic brushes, so much so that I make sure that I take care of them really well. So what I do is I always make sure at the end of the day they're clean, even like I've always done that. I never finish the day with my brushes not being clean. The paint water doesn't get changed at the end of the day. I always change it at the beginning, partly now because the cat drinks out of it when I'm not looking. So whenever I go in at the beginning of the day in the studio, there's always cat hair floating in there. So I change the water at the beginning of the session rather than at the end. But I change the water a lot as I go through, because I think having constantly clean water to work in stops you contaminating things, and it also is a bit easier on your brushes, because then you know that the colour is in your brush, not in the water. So if that makes sense. So if you're transferring colour, sometimes you can transfer it from your brush because you haven't cleaned it out well enough. And I always have multiple containers for water as well. So I have a large container that I use most of the time, and then I always have one that I keep really clean, and that's for when I change colour. I will always make sure I rinse the brush out in that one before I actually change colour. I have another one for where my ink goes, and I have another one that I use purely for if I've used gouache, which we'll get into in a minute. But my basic brush care goes, at the end of the day, make sure they're clean, and I always am making sure that all the bristles are sort of together. If you start getting rogue bristles, trim them off. I get rid of them. I have a favourite old brush, which I swear has about a third of the bristles it started with, because I've just trimmed them as it's gotten hairier and hairier over the years. But these I found are actually really hardy, and shorter bristle brushes are a bit hardier than long bristle ones. And I'd never leave them in the water. That's the other thing. Like if I'm not using them, they're upright in a mug on my desk. So I never, leave them in the water, go make a cup of tea and come back. I always make sure that they're out, at least lying on my desk. I never leave them in the water, because then you get all the cracking in the wood, the paint will peel off, and they're just not very pleasant to use. So make sure you don't leave them in the water. Store them upright in a mug or something. And if you do find that you're having trouble getting rid of some of the colour out of them, every couple of weeks I go through and I clean my paint brushes at the same time I do my makeup brushes, which has led to some mixing up of things. But I just use dishwashing liquid. I have used shampoo purely because I didn't have any dishwashing liquid, but you use a tiny amount and rinse them out really, really well. When you think you've rinsed them enough, rinse them again, because for sure you will have left a tiny amount in there, and then you end up with soap in your paint, which is not a good thing. So they're my big tips for brush care. Okay, don't leave them in the water, store them upright, give them a clean occasionally, and trim off any rogue hairs. The other thing Donna asked was if I use the same brushes for gouache as I do for watercolour. And the only one that I do tend to use is this 0. And that's if I'm putting highlights on a painting with gouache at the end on a watercolour painting, then I will use this brush. But I never use the same water container for gouache, and the gouache is never anywhere near my palette. I actually keep white gouache on a little tiny lid. It's about that big, about the size of an Australian 50-cent piece, that came in a little mini jam jar. And I leave my white gouache on that because that stuff will infect everything around it. And then you get the chalky residue in other colours and you lose all your luminosity. So gouache is always on a separate palette. I keep them as far away from each other as possible. And this is the only brush that ever crosses the two. And if I've done quite a bit of gouache, I will often go and clean this with a bit of dishwashing liquid just to make sure I don't infect them. So I am quite particular about keeping gouache and watercolour separate where I can. And also I find when I'm using gouache, I quite like a thicker or a sturdier bristled brush. This is a Dale Rowney Graduate. It's a filbert shape, which just refers to the rounded shape up the top. And I quite like that it's got a stiffer bristle. I also have a finer lining one as well. But these are the brushes I use for acrylics. So the brushes that I use for acrylics, I tend to use for gouache as well, because I find when I use gouache, I tend to use it quite thick, so that buttery consistency sort of works well for both. But not so well for watercolour, where it's all about picking up the paint and getting a fair amount on your brush so you don't get a tide mark. So no, I do tend to use different brushes for gouache. And Donna, the other thing you asked about was studio organisation, and I think that sort of warrants its own video at some stage. At the moment, the studio is a bit of a dumping ground because I'm taping a lino class. I have a couple of illustration jobs on, as well as doing some lino printing for myself and doing my own painting. So it's an absolute mess in there. But once I get it a little bit organised, there is method in my madness in there, but I would just be totally embarrassed to show it to you now. But I do have areas for every different thing, every different project. And it's a tiny, tiny room, so that's quite a balancing act sometimes. All right, so Donna, that's you done. Next, I want to talk about some questions I got from Jen. Now, Jen asked me about background. She said that she's noticed that I rarely do paintings that have a full background in them. I tend to do an object. And why do I do that? And why don't I do full backgrounds? And my question is, I do sometimes. I used to do it all the time, especially when you're at uni and the lecturers are always it's about situating something and you need context and all that sort of stuff. And I was big into everything almost being a still life. But I sort of changed along the way because often things get muddied when you do that. I found that I wasn't happy with my images. I felt as though there was too much crammed in. I wasn't focusing on the thing that I really wanted to paint, which, for example, might have been a vase of flowers. Like, if that's what was really appealing to me, then that's what I should paint. I don't need a background in there. And once I started to sort of take that approach, it worked really well. And then that dovetails in with the illustration type work I do as well, where often I'm creating vectors. So it's just a single item on a white background and then gets lifted up and placed into something digitally, sort of thing. So that sort of works together well. And also I just like the look of it. I love the look of the impact of bright colour against a fairly white background. I like that look. It feels clean and fresh to me. To me, it feels as though the colours stay fresher. Some of the cuppa paintings that I did recently had full backgrounds in them, and I still really like them. Don't get me wrong, I love them actually, but I find things can get too busy, and I like clean lines. I like clean lines in furniture and things like that. Not necessarily when I'm drawing, but I do like sort of that quite a simple sort of line, and that whole aesthetic of the white with the colour really appeals to me. So, for example, to give you an example, I just pulled this off the wall of the studio. So this is my favourite little bud vase, which is a beautiful little ceramic vase. Now, if I had have painted this against the wall it was in, with the painting in the background because it was on my desk and all the art supplies and everything else, I wouldn't have focused and I wouldn't have looked at how beautiful the flowers were and just the simplicity of the vase. So by editing out all of that background and that noise, that visual noise, it allowed me to just focus on what I really wanted to paint. And if I looked at it, that's what I wanted to paint. I didn't want to paint the stuff in the background. And I wanted the colours to be as crisp and bright as possible. So that meant giving it a fairly white background. Now, some things are good floating in space, and often in my work, images appear to float in space. But in this case, it didn't work so well. So what I did was I just basically grounded it by putting a bit of watercolour. Now, what I like about using this grounding method, which is, I don't know, I suppose that's kind of what I call it, is it enables you to fix compositional problems. Okay, so if you look at this colour here helps balance. Without that, this was too strong, okay? It stood out way too much, and that's all you noticed. You didn't notice this. So by pulling a bit of yellow into here, it actually sort of balanced that out. Then also it was a lot heavier on this side, so by running a bit of yellow up there, it made it look right. That's the best way to describe it, is when you add in a little bit of background, if you are just grounding something sort of thing, you're making it look right to the eye. Some things float beautifully, okay? A lot of the perfume bottles are completely floating in air. And that works, but often with things like a vase or maybe a drink bottle or something like that, it works better if you have something that shows where the ground is, because our eye reads it better. All right? So for me, it's about looking at it. I tend to draw it and go, okay, does it look complete or does it look a bit unbalanced? And then I make the decision whether or not I'm going to add in a little bit of background. So I usually add that in with a little bit of colour or a few lines, and I do it gradually, and then I will just look at it until I go, okay, that looks right. And when I sort of go, yep, that looks fine, then I leave it alone. And I rarely come back to them after that. So Jen, I hope that helps with your answer, your question, the answer you were looking for. And I'll move on to the next one. All right, so the next question I want to talk about really quickly is one from Alicia. Alicia asked me if I wanted to be an animal, what would it be? What kind of animal would I be? Which made me laugh, because this is the exact sort of question my daughter had been complaining about, because she's just started a new semester at uni, and you get the icebreakers, they drive her nuts. But I was thinking about it in the car on the way back from dropping her at the train, and you know what? I'd really like to be a pet that lives in our household, except a goldfish, because we always killed goldfish. We didn't mean to, we just were bad at taking care of them somehow. But like our dog Mushu was so spoiled. Like this mutt had the best life. And now we have a cat who adopted us, Barry. And I swear to you, the most spoiled cat in the history of the world. And he, when I came home, he complained bitterly because I'd left him and didn't take him in the car to drop Phoebes off to the train station. And so he followed me upstairs and was complaining so loudly. I closed up the room, put on the air conditioning and closed the curtains, because he likes a nice, dark, quiet, cool room to sleep in during the day. And it wasn't until I got downstairs that I realised that's a little bit mad. I mean, 6 months ago this cat was living on the street, and now he has me trained to be doing that. So I would probably want to come back as one of our pets, because they are so spoiled. So Alicia, that's what I would want to be. Another question that I was asked, let me just have a look at my book here. I have pages of them. All right, Annette asked me about how do you begin to sell online, and asked me for Etsy tips. Now, I'm going to be upfront, my Etsy store is an absolute dud. I think I've sold 2 things through there, but I'm not very good at keeping it up to date or anything. I sell a lot more on my website. I probably sell on average a couple a week. And And it took me a long time to sort of make that leap. Annette, I had been selling it through different stores. I'd actually approached stores and been selling my work there, prints and things like that for a long time. And then people would contact me, and I waited until I was getting regular people contacting me. Like they'd say, oh, do you, you know, people who read my blog or followed me online would say, you know, do you have a print of that? They would see a painting I put up. And I would say, sure, I can make you one. And when that was happening regularly, that's when I sort of took the next step. And I did throw it together quite quickly. I only did this last year, and I did throw it together really quickly. I don't have great photos on there. I don't have anything like that, and I'm in the process of redoing that. I've actually spent a day last week doing photos, which I'm now processing and all that. I had to learn a lot of that stuff because I'm not a great photographer. And then basically what I'm doing is I'm in the process of getting my Etsy shop and my online store looking the same, because some people prefer Etsy, some people prefer an online store, and so if I have them both the same, I can basically run them a bit better. But for me, I didn't go into it as a business. I'm not very good at that business side. So I waited until I felt there was a bit of demand, and I'm terrible at marketing them. I do everything wrong, you know, pretty much everything they say when you go and, you know, you look at the list of things you should do to have a successful Etsy store. I don't do any of them, which is probably why I don't get the sales. But I also don't do it on my website, and I still get the sales there. So I'm probably not the best person to ask. I'm going to be honest. Hopefully in 6 months, I will say, oh yes, I regularly sell this and that. But at the moment, you know, my online store on my website, and I think traffic is driven there through social media, through Instagram especially. That feeds a lot of traffic to my website, and that's where I get most of my sales. So you've got to make sure everything's linked up. Pinterest and Instagram, for me, are the big drivers. So make sure you have everything linked and probably plan it a bit better. I've just gone in higgledy-piggledy, and now I've got a huge job trying to get them all working together. But, you know, I'm starting to get there. So good luck with that is all I can say. So I think that's enough for the first video. We might finish this one up there, and then I'll attack a few more questions in another one.